You've probably seen the paintings. 12 men sitting around a table, calm, composed, almost like they were chosen because they already fit the role, like they belonged there from the beginning. But when you actually read the Gospels, that picture falls apart pretty quickly. Because before any of them are chosen, Jesus spends an entire night alone in prayer. Not an hour, not a moment, an entire night. And when morning comes, he calls his followers to him and begins naming the 12. The list doesn't make sense, not if you're trying to build something that outlasts empires. He starts with Simon, a fisherman, and immediately gives him a new name, Peter, which means rock. And if you already knew how the story ended, that might seem fitting, but if you actually follow him through the Gospels, he's anything but steady. He's the one who steps out of the boat onto the water because Jesus calls him. And for a moment, it works. He's actually walking. And then he notices the wind, looks down, and everything falls apart beneath him. He starts to sink, and Jesus has to pull him up. Later, Peter is the one who says out loud, "You are the Messiah." And it's a defining moment until a few minutes later when Jesus starts talking about the cross and Peter pulls him aside to correct him. And Jesus responds more sharply than he does with anyone else. And then there's the night that Jesus is arrested. Peter follows at a distance, standing near a fire while everything is unfolding. Someone recognizes him and says, "You were with him." And Peter denies it, not once, but 3 times. Each time a little more forceful until the moment breaks with the sound of a rooster, and suddenly everything he said earlier about loyalty collapses in real time. That's the man Jesus called Rock. James and John are just as intense, but in a different sort of way. They're brothers, also fishermen, and Jesus gives them a nickname, Sons of Thunder, which starts to make sense when you watch them. At one point, when a village refuses to welcome Jesus, they ask him directly if he wants them to call down fire from heaven and destroy it. They're not being dramatic, they mean it. And later, they come to him with a different request, asking to sit at his right and left when he comes into power. They understand that he's bringing a kingdom, but they're still thinking in terms of position and status. And the other disciples hear that and they're angry. This group isn't unified. They're competitive, reactive, trying to figure out where exactly they stand with Jesus. Andrew, Peter's brother, moves differently. He's one of the first to follow Jesus, but you don't see him stepping into the spotlight. Instead, you see him bringing people. The first thing he does after meeting Jesus is go find Peter and bring him along. Later, when thousands of people are gathered and there's no food, Andrew is the one who notices a boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. It's not enough. And he says that, but he brings him anyway. And when outsiders show up later, Greeks who want to meet Jesus, but don't know how to approach him, they go to Philip, and Philip goes to Andrew, and Andrew brings them forward. He keeps doing that. Philip, on the other hand, tends to see the situation as it is. When Jesus looks at a crowd and asks where they're going to get food, Philip immediately calculates the cost. And he's not wrong. He just doesn't see past the numbers. And even later, after everything he's witnessed, he says, "Show us the Father, and that will be enough," as if he's still trying to grasp something just beyond reach. Then Bartholomew, also called Nathanael, doesn't start with belief. When he hears that Jesus is from Nazareth, his first response is, "Can anything good come from there?" It's dismissive, immediate. But when he actually meets Jesus, something shifts, not because of an argument, but because Jesus tells him he saw him earlier, sitting under a fig tree, before anyone had called him. It's enough to stop him. And suddenly the skepticism gives way to something else entirely. Thomas gets remembered for doubt, but that's not the whole story for him. When Jesus says they're going back toward a place where people have already tried to kill him, the other disciples hesitate. Thomas doesn't. He says, "Let's go too, so we can die with him." He fully expects that's where it's going. Later, when the others say Jesus is alive, Thomas isn't there, and he refuses to accept it secondhand. He says he needs to see it himself. And when Jesus appears and offers exactly what he asks for, Thomas doesn't even reach out. He just says, "My Lord and my God." Matthew is sitting at a tax booth when Jesus finds him. He's working for Rome, collecting money from his own people. It's a position that made him wealthy and isolated. Jesus walks up and simply says, "Follow me." And Matthew gets up and leaves. That night, he throws a dinner and invites people like him, tax collectors, outsiders, and Jesus sits with them. And when the religious leaders question it, Jesus answers plainly. This is exactly who he came for. Now, put Matthew in the same group as Simon the Zealot. Simon comes from a movement that opposed Rome, sometimes violently. To him, men like Matthew weren't neutral, they were part of the problem. And now they're working together, eating together, staying in the same group. Nothing about that resolves easily. James, son of Alphaeus, is named among the 12, but beyond that, the Gospels don't record anything he says. No defining moment, no big speech, and yet he's still there, part of the group that stays with Jesus through everything. Thaddaeus, also called Judas, son of James, speaks once, asking why Jesus doesn't reveal himself to everybody openly. It's an honest question, and Jesus answers by shifting the focus away from public display into something more personal, something that happens within people rather than in front of them. And then there's Judas Iscariot. He's trusted enough to handle the group's money, but John tells us he's been taking from it quietly. And when a woman pours expensive perfume on Jesus, Judas objects, saying it should have been sold and given to the poor. It sounds right, but it isn't. Later in the garden, he approaches Jesus and identifies him with a kiss. And everything that had been building privately becomes visible in a single moment. Afterward, Judas realizes what he's done. He tries to return the money, admits he betrayed innocent blood, but nothing reverses, and he walks away, carrying something he can't undo. And after that, the group is down to 11. They gather, pray, and eventually choose Matthias to take his place. There's no dramatic moment around him, just a decision to keep moving forward, to fill what's been left behind. When you take a step back and look at them together, it doesn't feel like a list. And if you leave each one of their stories at where they began, then it looks like Jesus shouldn't be in charge of choosing the roster for any group. But the power isn't just in where they started, it's in how they finished. It's in how they come together, because it feels like it's a group that shouldn't work. A man who sinks, a man who doubts, a man who questions, a man who brings others, a man who compromises, a man who resists, men who argue about status, and one who betrays. And yet they stay. Not because they figured it out, but because something kept holding them together. And the longer they stayed, the more they grew, the more they were shaped by nearness to the Son. And because something kept holding them together long enough, they changed. And that's where the story actually begins for this group of followers. See, the 12 disciples are the perfect example that Jesus never chose people fully with it and fully competent. He chose ordinary people that followed him and along the way listened and adapted and grew. And really, from the Old and New Testament, that's always been God's story with humanity. Now, if you stop with the Gospels, then it looks unfinished. And if you stop with just where the disciples begin, then it looks like Jesus is the last person who should be putting together a team. You have a group of men who followed closely, misunderstood often, failed in visible ways, and scattered when things mattered most. Even at the end, they're not standing strong. They're behind closed doors, unsure of what comes next. That's not how movements usually begin, but Acts picks up the story from that point, not with a new group, but with the same men that we've been following. And the first thing you notice is not that they've become different people overnight, it's that something has happened to them that doesn't come from them. Peter is the easiest place to see it. The same man who stood in the courtyard denying he even knew Jesus is now standing in the open in front of a crowd that includes the same kind of people who would have been there that night. And this time he doesn't hesitate. He speaks clearly, directly. He tells them exactly who Jesus is, exactly what happened, and what it means. And when the crowd pushes back, when the pressure rises, he doesn't retreat. He keeps speaking. The difference isn't that Peter finally figured himself out, it's that he's no longer trying to hold himself together. James, the brother of John, doesn't get a long second act. The same intensity that once wanted to call down fire doesn't disappear, but it shows up differently as time goes on. When the opposition grows, when the early movement becomes something Rome begins to notice, James is one of the first to be executed. There's no speech recorded, no moment of defense, just a life that ends because he didn't step back. John's story stretches further. The one who once asked for position, who wanted to sit close to power, becomes the one who writes about love as if everything depends on it. His letters don't sound like ambition anymore. They sound like someone who spent enough time close to Jesus that everything else has faded. And at the end of his life, he's not at the center of influence. He's on an island. He's exiled, still writing. And Andrew continues the same way he always did. There's no moment where he suddenly becomes the central figure, no shift into leadership that places him above the others. He keeps moving in the same direction, bringing people. Tradition places him far from where the story started, in places north of where most of the others traveled. And it ends the same way many of their stories do, with a cross. Not in the center of attention, but still pointing people forward. Philip moves outward. The same man who needed clarity, who wanted to see and understand, carries the message into places where clarity isn't easy to hold on to. He steps into regions where the language, the culture, and the expectations are all different, and the story still moves through him. Not because everything became simple, but because he stayed with it long enough for it to make sense in a different way. Nathanael, or Bartholomew, doesn't stay where he started either. The man who questioned whether anything good could come from Nazareth becomes someone who carries the same message into places far beyond it. There's no record of speeches or moments like Peter's, but the tradition surrounding him places him in regions where the story had to cross entirely different boundaries. The skepticism didn't disappear. It turned into something that could recognize truth when it finally found it. Thomas goes further than most. The one who needed to see, who held back until he was certain, carries the story into places where certainty would have been harder to hold on to. Tradition places him in India, far from where any of this began, speaking about something he once struggled to believe himself. And it ends with the same kind of cost the others face. The one who questioned the most goes the furthest. Matthew leaves behind the world he knew completely. The man who once sat at a booth collecting from others now spends his life giving something away. The message he records becomes one of the clearest accounts of Jesus' life, written for people trying to understand how all of this fits together. The same instinct that once kept him inside a system now drives him to explain something that moves beyond it. Simon the Zealot doesn't stay defined by what he resisted. The energy that once pushed against Rome gets redirected into something that doesn't look like revolution at all. He doesn't overthrow systems, he outlives them. The same intensity is there, but it's no longer aimed at tearing something down. James, son of Alphaeus, remains quiet. There's no sudden shift where he becomes known, no moment where everything focuses on him, and yet he stays part of what spreads outward, faithful in a way that doesn't draw attention. The story doesn't leave him behind, it just doesn't center on him. Thaddaeus carries the same question he asked earlier, but now it's lived out. The message doesn't spread through overwhelming displays, it spreads through people, through conversations, through lives that change in ways that don't force attention but slowly reshape it. And then there's Judas. His story doesn't continue outward the way the others do. And that matters because it draws a line that you can't ignore. The same proximity, the same moments, the same opportunities, and a different ending. Not because he wasn't there, but because of what he chose to do with what he was given. Matthias steps into the space that's left. No defining moment, no clear distinction that sets him apart from the beginning, just someone who becomes part of the continuation because the story doesn't hinge on a single personality, it moves forward regardless. When you look at them together before and after, it's not a clean transformation. It's not a group of men who suddenly become perfect. It's a group of men who stay long enough to be changed. Peter is still bold, but now he stands instead of collapsing. Thomas still has questions, but now he carries conviction into places that cost him. John still has intensity, but now it shows up as love. Matthew still works with systems, but now he's building something different. Simon still has fire, but it's no longer aimed at the same target. Some speak loudly, some remain almost invisible. Some travel far, some don't leave much record behind at all. But all of them move, not in the same way, not with the same influence, not in the same direction. And that's the point, because nothing about them on their own explains what happens next. Fishermen don't build movements that reach across empires. Tax collectors don't become the foundation of something that outlasts Rome. Men who argue about status don't hold together long enough to change anything. And yet they do. Not because they became extraordinary, but because something worked through them that didn't come from them. And that is what carries the story forward. God working with ordinary people, with everyday people, and giving them a point and purpose, showing them a different way of life is exactly the point and exactly how God has historically worked with humanity. If you appreciated this explanation and would like to hear more, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an upload. Leave a comment. Let me know what else you want to hear me cover. Until next time, God bless.